As more and more companies move into Agile transformations, I thought it would be useful to share some of my experience and my company's experience in helping companies with their Agile transformations. We've been helping companies with Agile transformations specifically for about 10 years. We've been helping companies with software development transformations in general for about 20 years. We've learned quite a bit over the years about how to make these transformations successful. In Agile transformations, we see two interpretations of the phrase Agile transformation on the ground. One interpretation really puts the emphasis on Agile, that is, Agile transformation. This is the most common interpretation. There's not much focus on transformation. Transformations that see the primary challenge of the transformation as being about the details of Agile are the transformations that we see fail. That is, they're focused on the details of Scrum or Kanban, but really ignore the transformation aspect, and those don't tend to work out very well. Transformations that focus on transformation tend to do better. They recognize that Agile is important, but the make or break focus of the transformation is the transformation itself, and that's what I'd like to talk about in this talk. What this talk is not about, it's not about the details of Agile practices. It's not about choosing the best unit testing tool or the details of how to hold a daily stand-up meeting. It's also not about the bigger picture items of questions like how to use Scrum effectively or how to use Kanban. What it is about transformation. That is, it's about organizational change. And what we have found is that you will run into this set of transformation issues described in this talk and the companion talk, no matter what kind of Agile transformation you have in mind. So if you're simply adopting practice like Scrum or Kanban, you'll run into these issues. If you're taking a bigger change like moving to a scaling model like SAFe or LESS or DAD, you will run into these issues. There are two models that we think are useful to apply to your Agile transformation, the change model and the adoption model. I discussed the change model in a different talk, a companion talk. In this talk, I'd like to focus on the adoption model. So let's move into the discussion of the adoption model. The adoption model really comes up in response to a common pattern that we see with transformations, which looks kind of like this. Step number one, an organization commits to a change. Step number two, they do an initial pilot project for the change, and the pilot project is successful. So naturally, as the result of a successful pilot project, they want to expand the use of that change. And so what they do is they have a second or third project that attempts to make the change, but that second or third project doesn't do as well as the pilot. It stumbles or fails. The project might fail outright. The project team might abandon the change. That is, they simply stop using the change and they go back to old familiar practices. Or sometimes the organization can't even find project teams that are willing to be the second or third project team, and so the change really stalls right away because they can't find additional teams that actually want to use it. There's actually a really fairly tidy way to explain this dynamic, and I think to overcome these challenges, and that's based on an adoption model. The specific model is inspired by work by Everett Rogers and then later by Geoffrey Moore. It's probably somewhat familiar to people who have read the book Crossing the Chasm or the earlier and much more extensive book by Everett Rogers, Diffusion of Innovation. And the basic model looks like this. The basic model says for any new practice, and this is really talking more about industries or larger groups. The focus isn't really on individual companies, but that's what I'm going to apply it to today. Any change starts out being adopted by innovators, and if the change makes it through the innovators, then it's adopted by the early adopters. If it makes it through the early adopters, then it moves into early majority, and then into late majority, and finally into the laggards. The change can actually stall at any one of these points, but in general, the adoption of the change moves from left to right according to this model. Now, Geoffrey Moore's contribution to this model was really to identify what he called the chasm, and that is to say that the gap between the early adopters and the early majority in terms of getting the change diffused is bigger than the gap between any of the other pairs of adjacent adoption groups. And so that's why he said his book was titled Crossing the Chasm, is that it's much more difficult to get the change to cross that chasm than it is to cross the gap, say, between innovators and early adopters or between early majority, late majority, and so on. So Typical applications of innovation diffusion are things like diffusion of new agricultural technologies. Indeed, Everett Rogers said something to the effect that it's impossible to write more than 25 words about diffusion of innovation without talking about the U.S. Agricultural Extension Program, really one of the premier technology innovation organizations in the world. We also talk, of course, with Geoffrey Moore's work about market adoption of innovations. What I would really like to talk about is applying this innovation diffusion model to agile transformations within individual organizations. So thinking of a diffusion of an innovation and an agile transformation as related topics. What we see is that different adopters within a single organization exhibit these different preferences of different people or different groups in the innovation adoption sequence. So some adopters exhibit tendencies more like the innovators. Some adopters exhibit tendencies more like the early adopters or the early majority or even the late majority or laggards. And these different groups have different kinds of attributes. So if we look at, say, the innovators, the far left part of the innovation adoption sequence, the kinds of characteristics the innovators tend to have are like this. They tend to be adventurous. They like to try new things. They are eager to try out new technologies or practices. They actually can cope with a high degree of uncertainty. They are willing to put up with uncertainty in exchange for getting into something that is new and cool before anybody else does. They are highly risk tolerant. They're willing to have all kinds of things go wrong because going through all those things that are going wrong actually creates the possibility that they could experience the benefits of that new cool thing before other people do. They tend to fail often. And this is kind of a problem in a way because it actually costs them credibility to people in the other categories. People in the early majority, late majority, and laggard category may not respect the innovators because they do in fact fail so often. And the later categories don't see the innovators so much as being the ones who are trying new things. They see the innovators as being wild and reckless and irresponsible. And that's just what it looks like from their point of view. Now, if we move to the early adopters, they also exhibit some predictable kinds of attributes that are similar to the innovators, but not exactly the same. They are also highly risk tolerant, like the innovators are. They're looking, though, for the big win. They're still attracted to things that are new and cool, but they're attracted to them more because there's a potential to get a really big competitive win there. They actually, unlike the innovators, tend to be respected opinion leaders in their organizations. People in the early majority actually look to them to see if the technology or innovation is far enough along the line yet for them to think about adopting it. So they end up being role models for other people and other adopters in the organization. So the commonalities that innovators and early adopters have look like this. They're attracted to innovation for the sake of novelty. They're attracted to it because it's new. They're looking for a big win. They're not looking for incremental wins. They're not looking for base hits. They're looking for home runs. They're highly risk tolerant, and they share some attributes in their approach to change. One attribute is they're highly motivated to see the change work. They want the innovation to be successful. They want the new cool thing to be new and cool so that they can use it. And they share that attribute. They also are willing to exert substantial personal energy and personal initiative to make the change work. And what this means is that when they encounter obstacles with the change, they're willing to learn about it by reading, seeking out colleagues. They are going to exert personal energy and initiative to overcome obstacles. Indeed, they actually see challenges with the change as opportunities to make the new thing work before others do. So far from being put off by challenges, they actually run into them headlong. The bottom line is that these people can succeed with very little external support. They are highly motivated to be successful, highly motivated to be successful specifically with the change. Now, here's the $64 question for organizations that want to do an agile transformation. Guess who typically works on pilot projects? Well, the answer is the innovators and early adopters. Those are the people who are excited by the new cool technology, whether the new cool technology is Scrum 10 years ago or Kanban 5 to 10 years ago, or whether it's SAFe or LESS or DAD or something else. It's the innovators and early adopters who are staffing these pilot projects. And so that sets up some interesting challenges. When we look at trying to propagate out a change to the later adoption groups, the early majority and later groups, they do not have the same attributes that the innovators and early adopters do. They tend to be cautious, rather than adventurous. They tend to want to see someone else succeed with the change first. The further to the right we get in the adoption sequence, they want not only to see someone else succeed, they want to see everybody else succeed. They want to think that there's no chance of failing with it. These folks do not like uncertainty. And they are not very risk tolerant, and they really don't like to fail. So they want a high assurance that when they adopt the change, they are going to be successful. Now, the issue with all this is we're not just talking about the laggards. We're talking about most of the people, that is the right more than 3/4 of the diagram. And if we compare and contrast the attributes of the early majority, or let's say the early adopters, the 2 groups on the left, and the later adopters, the 3 groups on the right, the contrast looks kind of like this. The early adopters are attracted to innovation for the sake of innovation. The early majority and later are attracted to innovation for the sake of improved quality or productivity. They're not attracted to things that are new just because they're new. They want there to be a benefit that's different just from the novelty of it. The earlier adopters are looking for revolutionary, game-changing gains. They want home runs. The later adopters are looking for incremental gains. They want assurance that they're going to get a modest-sized gain rather than a chance that they might get a huge gain. The early adopters are risk-tolerant or highly risk-tolerant, but the later adopters are either not very risk-tolerant, they might be risk-averse, or they might even be highly risk-averse by the time we get out to the right side of the innovation adoption sequence. The earlier adopters are highly motivated to make the change work. The later adopters range from being moderately motivated to see the change work to being actually motivated to see the change fail. Now, when I say it as motivated to see the change fail, that makes it sound like they're evil. They're not really evil. What they're really motivated to do is to keep things the same, to not change. And so it's not really that they want to see the change fail. It's that they just want evidence that they don't have to change. There's no reason to change so that they can keep things the way that are familiar and comfortable. The earlier adopters are willing to exert a lot of personal energy and initiative to make the change work. The later adopters are really not willing to exert very much personal energy to make the change work. In fact, they tend to see the need for that as evidence that the change isn't going to work or isn't a good idea. And so similarly, the early adopters see challenges as opportunities. The later adopters see challenges as evidence that the change is a bad idea. So implications for this are that the support needed to make the change successful shifts a lot from the earlier adopters to the later adopters. The early adopters are really self-motivated. They don't require very much support. Often you really have to keep them from diving headlong into a new area, far from needing to provide support. The later adopters, though, require support ranging from moderate levels of support to really high levels of support. So let's take a look at differences in the support needed for earlier versus later adopters. The innovators and early adopters need permission to try the change. Maybe. A lot of times they don't need permission, or they don't think they need to because they're so eager to try the thing that's new. On the other hand, the later adopters actually do need explicit permission and encouragement to try the change. You might have to tell them quite a few times that not only is it okay to try the change, but you want them to try the change, you're going to support them in making the change, and so on. They also need incentives to try the change. They are not motivated by change for the sake of change. They want to know what is the benefit to them. They are going to need training support because they don't have the same level of motivation in seeking out online resources and user groups and discussions with peers. They're going to need some more support in actually getting spun up to be able and capable of doing the change. They might need consulting support as well. So really, collectively, what we really need, or what we're really finding, is that the later adopters need a lot of support in adopting the change and making it be successful. And so what we find in organizations is that the pattern here is that the experience with the early adopters is misleading about how much support the organization as a whole is going to need to be successful as we get into the later adopters. And this is critical because the later adopters actually make up the majority of the adopters that you need for a successful transformation. If If we go back and look at this diagram, this isn't just drawn as a bell curve for the sake of making a nice looking diagram. It's drawn as a bell curve because these proportions are meant to be taken literally. What that means is that the leftmost two groups make up about 15% of the total number of adopters in the organization. So as we look at our staff profile over time for transformation, the early adopters adopt early. They make up 15%. If our transformation is successful, the later adopters, by the time they all adopt it, make up 85% of the total adopters. And if we look at the level of support needed for these groups, what we see is that the early adopters need very little support, the later adopters need much higher support, and the problem organizations run into is that they tend to make their transformation plans after the pilot project is completed, when we really only have early adopters having adopted the innovation, and the implication is that we actually expect a low level of support is needed because we're overgeneralizing from the experience with the earlier adopters. So in general, organizations end up being really overly optimistic about the level of support needed for the last 85% of the transformation to make the Agile transformation successful. So to summarize, early adopters make it look easy, and in some sense that's not a compliment, or at least it's problematic. That is to say, they make it look easy and create a misleading idea of the level of support that the organization is going to need to put in place to make the transformation successful across the entire group of people who need to complete the adoption. Later adopters make up the vast majority of staff you need to reach for a successful adoption, and they need more kinds of support and deeper levels of support than the early adopters do. We see a lot of Agile transformations stumble or fail due to overgeneralizing from experience with pilot projects that are staffed with a category of staff that is not representative of the staff of the organization as a whole. And the support needed is described in the companion talk on the change model, which goes through the details of the various kinds of support that you need to put in place to make an Agile transformation successful. So that's really the adoption model. Check out the companion talk on the change model, and that should give you some pretty good support for understanding what's really needed to make an Agile transformation successful.